thank you for coming to the first seminar for GSL 25. We're really happy to have you here, and we're really happy with the seminars that we have lined up. And this will be the first one, as you know. So 2 years ago, we were here in this very place, and Greg Nichols showed up with a fantastic model. And it's right up here. I'm sure you all remember. If you were here 2 years ago, you remember looking at it and how good it is. And as is the custom with GSL, the car that wins best of show, we ask the builder to come back next time and give a seminar on what he did and how he did it, he or she, I should say. And so Greg is here with Backdraft, fantastic model car. And he's going to talk to us about, again, what he did and how he did it. So now, while we're filming the seminars, as we always do, so if you would please turn your cell phones off or onto vibrate or whatever, so that the ringing of the phones doesn't get picked up on the sound and on the tape. So without any further delay, let's turn the time over to Greg Nichols. Thanks for being here, Greg.
Very touchy microphone. Is it working okay? Yeah. First off, it's great to be back. 2 years went by really quickly. How many people are here for the first time? Oh, pretty good crowd.
You guys.
Well, welcome. The reason I ask is Mark called me up and asked me to do this seminar, and I said, sure, I'd be happy to. But I've used this model in seminars a few times here. I said, yeah, aren't people getting tired of listening to it? And he said, no, you need to start at the beginning and tell the whole story. And I said, be careful what you ask for, because it's a long story, but we'll endeavor to do so. What I thought I would do, instead of starting with a kit review, there was no kit, is just kind of talk about the materials that were used. And very simple. Don't move. Most of the parts started out as aluminum and brass rods, different dimensions. You can buy them in 6-foot lengths from a company called Enco. They're in Massachusetts, but there's companies all over the place. And then I would also go to a local scrap metal yard with a pail and pick out larger pieces, because I didn't want a 6-foot piece that cost $1 zillion. So most of it started with aluminum brass, and then just K&S brass from your local hobby store, sheets of brass, a few different shapes, some channel, some tubing, a few different sizes. And also I used some mahogany and maple to make bucks to form the parts over, and they're up here, you can look at them later. And then parts that I bought, I got a list here so I don't forget anybody. Used a lot of stainless steel tubing from small parts. Now, they have this in a variety of different sizes, and each outside diameter, they tend to have 3 different sizes. So they have a thin wall tubing, a regular tubing, and a thick wall tubing. So it's important to think about not only what diameter you want, but what size inside hole you need, depending on what you're using it for and how strong it has to be. It's a great product. They come in a bunch of tubes. You get plenty. You'll have a life supply. And then from RB Motion, used a lot of their rod ends, the springs for the shocks, acorn nuts, and then from Scale Hardware, a lot of their miniature nuts and bolts. They're steel miniature nuts and bolts. You can buy nut drivers from them and taps, or you can make your own just using a piece of brass tubing. You drill the end so it's just the right size for the head of the bolt to fit in, and then just crimp it. Lost the microphone? It's all right. I found it. It's right here. You just crimp on it, and then you've got your own nut driver. And you can also take and use a little JB weld to attach one of the bolts to the end of a piece of brass rod, and then you have a tap, because you're usually using a softer material than the steel that the bolts were made out of. But a large portion of this model is actually bolted together instead of being glued together. The only parts on the model that I did not machine were done by Bob Dudek. He did the front axle on a CNC machine. I'll have a picture of that later. The only pieces of plastic on the model are the headlight lenses. They're from a Revell 32 Ford. And then from Model House, I got some Cadillac taillight lenses. And the rear tires, the white resin inserts are from Model House. As we go on, if you have a question, please don't hesitate to ask. But we require people to use the microphone when they ask a question so that when someone watches this video later on, it kind of has a flow and makes sense. All right? All right. So first off, I want to thank the town of Newburgh, Model Car Club, for sponsoring the show tonight. Yay! I travel with my own peanut gallery. All right, a couple things on the model. It's 1/24th scale, and I'll explain why it's that scale in a minute. It's almost completely scratch built. Constructed, of course, out of brass and aluminum. There's over 1,430 pieces on this model, which is kind of a lot for a little 24 scale model. And I spent over 11 and a half years building it. Now, not working all the time, but that's the time period it took. Now, to some people that may seem like an enormous amount of time. To others, it may be a drop in the bucket. But I want to talk about a time commitment on a long-running project, just for a minute. If you think about a regular model that you would build, a kit that you would buy and put together, and the normal steps that you would go through, you're going to spend, I got ahead of myself. You're going to spend about 90% of your time putting it together, and maybe 10% of your time researching or scratch building a few parts. If you scratch build a model, it's almost completely the reverse. About 10% of your total time will be spent actually building the model, putting it together, and the way you think of assembling a model. The rest of your time will be spent in research and design and in making the parts. So when you go into a project like this, you need to realize how your time is going to be spent. It's not just putting the model together. That's a very small part of the project. Would you agree, Randy?
I would agree.
You have a smile on your face there, exactly. Okay. Now, if you're going to scratch build a model, two ends of the spectrum you can look at would be to build a replica or to build something you designed yourself. And of course, there's all shades of gray in between. So a nice example of a replica, of course, is Randy's 2011 Best in Show winning sprint car model. Now, a few things about building a replica. You are kind of working in a box. And what I mean about that is the model has already been designed. You're building a duplicate of it. So your project really is to research. Now, Randy had the perfect model because he actually had access to the car and the person who owned it. You can't really make changes along the way. Not if you're really going to build an accurate replica. And 2 years ago in Randy's seminar, he talked about around the seat and how the project almost never got finished because he couldn't figure out how to get the seat to look right. But he couldn't change the design. He had to replicate what was there. Now in design, this is a model that won GSL in 2005 that was built by Dave Cummings. When you build a model you design yourself, you have a blank sheet of paper that you could do anything. You have to design and engineer the project yourself, and you can make changes as you need. You basically go through the process that the person that built the sprint car that Randy made a duplicate of, the process they went through when they built that. something wouldn't fit, they'd change it. You're going through that same process when you design a model yourself and put it together. All right, the beginning. Mark said start at the beginning. All right, the beginning of this project began with a drawing that was done by Jairus Watson that was in one of the early issues of Model Cars magazine. A little 32 boat tail. And he used the MT Vicky kit to convert it from. So I thought that would be a pretty neat project to do, so I started the project and kind of mocked it up. But the one thing I didn't like about it was that it used the engine that came in the kit was kind of a modern Ford engine. Well, there's got to be something that would look better in this old style boat. And I came across an image of this flathead. Well, that's perfect. That's just what I need. But to make it look right, it needed to be made out of aluminum. You could buy all the aftermarket parts, but it won't look like that image when you're done with it. So I had a Sherline lathe and milling machine and set about trying to make that engine. And here's some pictures of the block and the heads. I started with an actual picture of an actual flathead head and printed it out, took measurements of where everything was, converted it to 1/24 scale, started with a point in the center of the head and figured out where every hole needed to be drilled from there. And then after it was polished and the holes were drilled, then I cut the fins in it using a saw. One of the hardest parts was, anyways, this is more difficult to use than I thought. The oil pumps were real difficult to machine. And this is a picture of doing the flanges for the exhaust pipe. And what I would do with parts that I needed duplicates of, I would stack them in the piece. So I'd use a part vertically. First I would cut it to size on the lathe so I'd know the thickness of the part. Then I'd put it over in the mill and machine the part shape. And then when I cut them off, I would have a duplicate. So instead of making them one at a time, you're making them 10 at a time. Well, those are all the parts that make up the engine, the basic engine. And I showed up here at GSL in 2003 with bags of parts and spent the whole convention in my hotel room trying to put this thing together. For two reasons. One, I wanted to have something to enter. And Mark said, well, of course, you can enter that in specialty and you can come back with it in a car later. That's been done before. I said, fine. But also, Augie Hiscano, who I met here, 16 years ago, first time I came here. He's been gone for a number of years. Encouraged me to do more machining. I had a little Unimat lathe, and he said, no, you need to buy the right equipment and just do it. Just do the right thing. And I would see him here and I would see him at other shows. And he'd always, come on, you gotta. So I finally machined something that I was proud of, that I wanted to show him. And on Saturday afternoon, I was able to bring it down from my hotel room, more to show him than anything else.
That's that new Revell kit, isn't it?
Yeah. It stopped. All right.
It's running on the screen.
Is it really? Is the motor on it?
Yeah, we can hear
Okay.
Well, it's not running, but it's turning.
It's not on here.
it. Sure. The pictures are moving.
But Augie took that out of my hand and he just said, wow, look at this. And he just walked around the room showing it to people. And it just made my day. So I went home from GSL. Oh, now it's starting to ring. I went home from GSL and decided it was time to change what I was working on. The motor wasn't going into that boat tail that Jairus had designed. I wanted to see if I could design a car myself. I had an enormous amount of enjoyment building the engine. So, all right, let's try and build the rest of the car and see where it led. So I wanted to design the model myself. I wanted to scratch build as much as I could possibly scratch build. I wanted to incorporate a number of working parts. I wanted to have a high level of detail throughout the model. And when the model was done, I wanted to be able to see all that detail. It's difficult to build a model, especially in 1/24 scale, and then see all the detail when it's done. You got to find the right car. And the one thing that I could think of is the orange crate.
Yahoo!
The show and go hot rods of the late 50s, early 60s. Oops. They would display them with the bodies off. They'd take them to the drag strip and race them, and you could drive them around town. They were street legal vehicles. So I played around with a couple designs. Thought, well, I could just take a 32 and then have the body flip up, or I could take the body and modify it a little bit. And then I came across a long-forgotten model. This is the grasshopper that appeared in 1959 on Hot Rod Magazine. It's like from October. Monogram got a hold of this, and of course came out with a model called the Green Hornet that probably everybody here has had at least one of. And I had one sitting on the shelf, and I thought, what can I do with something that size? So I did a quick mock-up, and a real crude mock-up, and said, well, that's what I've been looking for. That's what I think I'm going to end up doing. So I sat down with some graph paper and started to design. And a few things that I found while researching the flathead engine was this image from, I don't know if it's Street Rodder or one of the other magazines. What I loved was you could look through the grill and see the engine behind it. And if you combine that with an Indy-style front end that had the shocks in the middle, you had a grill you could look through, the shocks, and then the engine behind it. Well, that would be a pretty cool looking car. The problem is, now the radiators have to go someplace else. And the front end has to be figured out, because I also wanted to use a straight axle. This is from one of, the Illuma Coupe?
Yeah.
This is the pickup truck. And what they did is they used, what the hell do they call it? Huh? Alumatub, is that what they call it? But the suspension, not a torque tube, what am I looking at? Torsion bar was in the frame, and you can see right underneath the radiator where the pivot point was, and where it comes out and hooks onto the front end. And I thought, well, if you take something, that design, and use that pivot point in the middle of your frame, and then you add an arm to it, you could now have your shocks in the center. And just keep the same pivot point. So I sat down with some graph paper, and the first drawing that I brought it with me tonight. This is the only design I did in 1/24 scale. After this, everything was drawn in 1/12 scale, and then I would measure it and split the measurement in half. But through all the years of building this, I kept coming back to this drawing. And the first idea ended up being the best idea. So any questions at all yet? Mike, you're behaving yourself.
Sorry.
Assembling the model. Most of it is soldered using a resistance soldering machine. Parts that couldn't be soldered, I use JB Weld mostly for putting the metal together. A little 5-minute epoxy, and of course, a lot of nuts and bolts. So the frame rails were just rectangular tubing that I drilled out. You know, I showed you how I made those parts stacked. Well, I machined, you see on the bottom picture at the angle, I machined a part that had that angle and then sliced off like little pieces. And I could put the side rails together using those parts because they had the angle machined into them. So you slide one part in and then the angled part on. It kept it centered, and you could solder it together and keep it perfect. And then you use the same angle on the top for the top piece. This is one of the cross members that has the transmission mount, and it's just from a piece of brass rod. And that part is the part that goes on the front that's going to work the front suspension. That will give me the pivot point in the frame. Now to put this all together, I made one thing. When you have a milling machine, not only can you make parts, but you can make really accurate jigs and fixtures to hold things in place. So I machined up a jig that would hold all the parts together. And that's the beginning of the frame. Nice and square, nice and straight. So next I had to figure out how to do the radiators. And they were going to go behind the driver. So I made frames, put a top on them, and those are parts that would be glued in later. So the roll bar and the seat frame were all intertwined into one part. That's how it would sit on the frame. And later, added to it to also mount the dash and the support for the steering. Now, I originally was going to make a woven seat, like you'd have on an old beach chair, but I couldn't find a material to use to weave, so I ended up making a solid part. But that is a point when you're designing something yourself, you can make a change. It doesn't work, do something else. There's a drawing of the fuel tank. This was made with telescoping tubing, cutting out the scallops in it. You can also see those are the tail lights with the resin lenses. The front grille was machined out of a solid piece of brass. And then the part with the fins in it, the grille itself, the surround is a solid piece of brass. The grille itself is also made from a solid piece of brass, the frame outside, and it was sawed from underneath to make the slots, and then the grills themselves were glued in, and then it was plated. And then the other part is the part that will go on the back of the grille surround, and it also mounts the headlights. I also did all my own plating using a Caswell plating kit. They're not that expensive and really easy to use. The key is prepping your work before you put it in the tank. And there it is, nestled together. And the frame is starting to come along. The struts in front of the seat were to support the steering box. That's another image of it. Now onto the body. In order to get air to the radiators, the airflow would have to come up from underneath the car. So I designed, well, this is the main part of the body. As you can see, the wooden buck made a pattern out of tape. Just put it on the brass sheet and cut it out, and then heated it so it was easy to work with. Bend it around the buck and soldered it in the back. Now this is one of the body designs. There were a few of them before I finally settled on one that I liked. For the belly pan, as I said, I wanted to make some venturi tunnels that would come up from underneath. So that's the shape I started with. There it is mounted on the frame. And here are the side pieces that when it's soldered up, we'll give you the picture there on the right. The part on the left is the door. This car has a door on the top instead of on the side. That was also just formed over a wooden buck. And there's the body. A lot of fitting still to go, but it's getting close. The interior panels for the car were going to be plated, so I wanted painted behind it, and then the panels would be plated with so you can see the color behind. To get the holes, that Swiss cheese look that I've done on so many hot rods, if you take a punch, that you can change the size of the hole, and you use a smaller size punch than the die, so one size difference. When you punch the hole, it'll give you that nice round crease on the inside. These hole punches are, you pick them up for 20 bucks and they do like almost a dozen different size holes. But you just want the punch to be one size smaller than the die that you're using. That's the body mocked up with panels on the inside. And we're starting to get close after a very long time. Now these are the parts that Bob Dudek machined for me using a CNC machine. I drilled a few more holes in the front axle. Then I had to machine all the little arms that will go on it to make everything work. The part on the left, the little small part on the bottom here, that's the way it came off of the milling machine. I'd go as far as I could, and then I'd finish it off by hand. There's the other parts. Now, the coilover shocks, I was just going to use the ones from RV Motion. I don't know if any of you have used them. They work. They're really cool. You put them together. And as I was assembling them, I noticed that if I turn the outside and thread the bottom of the spring support, I could not only have a working shock, but I could have an adjustable shock. And you might think that's a little crazy, and it is. But the reason for doing it is I can adjust how the model sits on the table after it's built. The belly pan of this car is very close to the ground. And I wanted to make sure if I had to lift it up a little bit, I would have the leeway to do that. Here's a closer look at it. The thin brake drums are 4 pieces that are stacked together. So to make the 4 drums, it's 16 pieces that are machined. Now I don't have any electronics on my milling machine. It's turning dials and keeping track of where you are. And if you lose concentration for a second, you get to start all over again. But it's no big deal. You put another piece of metal in and, 3 hours wasted and off you go.
Say bad words if you're somewhere.
A few. Well, this is a drawing of the rear suspension. Again, 1/12 scale for a 1/24 scale model. So now when you take your measurements, you cut it in half. If you make a little mistake, you also cut that mistake in half. And I did a lot of research online for the different parts. And if you look beyond a catalog, they'll have specs, the sizes where the holes are, and it basically will give you a blueprint for making your own parts. There's the rear suspension mocked up. So it has a Watts linkage and a torque tube. Torque tube keeps it from sliding forward to back. Watts linkage keeps it centered in the car. And the steering box. I bought a set of really small gears from Northwest Shoreline. They make parts for remotoring little model trains. And it was perfect. It was nice and tight. It had the right amounts of turn for the wheels to turn. But then when I got it all together, it went the wrong way. So I ended up having to make them myself. That's what it looks like there. More bad words there. So there's the car mocked up with the steering on it. One of the biggest challenges for me building this model, because it was so small, was clearance issues. So many little things. You scale down on a real car, a natural gap. Now scale that down to 1/24 scale and try to work with that. And this is a mock-up trying to get the radiator lines from the engine to the back of the car. Again, there was very little room for them. On to the wheels and tires. The rear wheels are aluminum. I was going to cast some in rubber. I made aluminum patterns. I didn't like how the ones that I made out of rubber came out, so I said, all right, we'll just paint the aluminum ones. And I used the resin inserts from the Model House tires. I basically went online and looked for the dimensions of the biggest cheater slicks I could find, and that's the dimensions that I used. The front tires came out of the parts box. One of the white walls broke, so the white walls are actually aluminum that are painted. There's the four of them together. Now, after making all these parts and figuring out how to mount them, this is what the frame looked like. I'd make a part, have to add the parts onto the frame to mount it. There's pictures. I have a book here I'll show you that has, if you haven't seen it, that has all this in it. Now it's time to paint, and finally, after years, it's time to build a model. I used Tamiya mica blue with black underneath it. It darkened it up and made the little metal flakes in it really pop. I built an assembly jig. I didn't want to have to handle this as I was putting it together. Real simple, and you could mount it one way or the other. This is the clutch pedal. It's time to make some controls. Since you were straddling the engine, you have your clutch on the left, and on the right you have the gas pedal and the brake pedal. The master cylinder actually just has a little spring in it that makes the brake pedal work. And the gas pedal, we'll get back to that later. Now, I found a thing on an old, from the 50s Hot Rod magazine, where they talked about a fuel system where you had a big tank on the back of the car. It went down through some sort of valve. Oops.
Picture.
Did it leave?
Yes.
Well, that's not helpful.
Now we're watching Netflix.
Yeah.
The internet dropped. I broke the internet. We could just watch HBO or something.
Yeah.
Come on. Talk among yourselves. There we go. No, it's just the thing that gives you the word. Okay. We're back. So, the article talked about having a large gas tank at the back of the car. It went down through a valve, and you had a small moon tank under the seat, or another place in the car that you'd use with a hand pump. So you'd have more gas on the car than you would have in a little moon tank, but you only had to pump up the little moon tank. So that's the system that I use. That's the little moon tank that lives underneath the seat. Here are the radiator lines. They're all plated and added to the car. And from the top. So the four lines coming back from the flathead. One night I sat down and made a battery, researched some old batteries online, and just used some screen and brass and a couple photo etched odds and ends. There it is mounted in the car. And here's the front suspension. Now, these arms are a little shorter than the original design. The pivot point is in the same place in the frame. But to get a front axle to work that's out in front of the car, that had to be transferred from where it was in the frame to the front. You just couldn't go straight out from here. So that's a piece of square tubing that was built into that arm. And here's the other parts. This little piece has a square end here that slides into that square piece and now will transfer the movement out to the front of the car. And they're mounted in the car. So this just slides in from the front and is keyed into this part. It works back to the spring. There it is from the back. And there it is on the car. So a small arm then is added with rod ends right here. So as this goes down, it twists this, and the suspension goes up, and the spring pushes it back down. That's a breakdown of the rear end. Adding all the nuts and bolts to it. And there it is, ready to go back on the car. So a quick change rear end with a Watts linkage on the top. And here it is, bolted in. So now we're getting close. Time to add in the radiators. I used photo etch radiator screen you can buy from model cars, Model Car Garage, with tubes in the center, so you can kind of see through it a little bit. There it is with fin brakes added. Sitting on the wheels for the first time. There's a view from the front. Now finishing off the body, I looked at vintage, like Formula One cars, for the rear view mirror stanchions. And on the bottom there is where the steering comes out. Here's the interior panels plated. And the look I was going for was inside the car. Now I dreaded making these parts the whole time. These are the little scallops that I wanted to plate and put over the body. But actually they were fairly simple to solder on. Locked up on the car. And the finished product. The scallop on the body actually goes all the way around the car. Now we get back to the engine. We left this years ago. Set it aside, use it for mocking up. It was time to make all the rest of the pieces that go on it. I couldn't find any boots for my spark plug wires that I liked, so I ended up making them out of brass. And there's a product called black in it. You can take brass, dip it in, turns black. No paint, no mess, just dip it in, set it on your workbench, it's done. There's a coil. Now, the gas pedal is on the right-hand side of this car. The throttle linkage is on the left-hand side of the motor. So I had to transfer up and over across the motor to get to it. There's 3 linkages to make this happen. This is the first one. And these are the other 2. Now those are sitting inside my wedding ring. There's a return spring on the large one, and then the really small one actually hooks up to the carburetors. So the engine went from this to that. Added a beehive oil filter. The belts are from an old printer cable. Here's some more images of it. You can see where the hoses come off towards the back to the radiators. I was almost blind by the time I got this done. There it is, finally mounted in the car. So before we put the seat on, these are pictures of the car, top and bottom. And here you can see where the radiator lines hook up. So the long ones were added before, and then I had to add these in and slide the hose clamps over. There's the steering box and the steering wheel put together. The steering wheel is actually 3 layers of brass. The center one's plated, and then the ones on the top and the bottom are black. And then they have rivets that go through them. So they were stacked. So I would drill the holes and then make each piece of the steering wheel so I could put it back together. And I couldn't find any gauges that I liked. So I went on Moon Eye's website. I stole their little Moon Eyes logo and then just used Illustrator to draw out the gauge faces. And a good friend, Doug White, who probably a lot of you know, took him to work and had a high, really precise printer and printed them out for me. So the gauges, each gauge is made up of a few pieces. There's the body of the gauge, then the gauge face, and I added a needle with just a little piece of wire, and then the clear top, and then the top ring for the gauge. And there's 6 of them. And they are with dash. They're mounted in there. And here's the dash almost finished. Now when that was mounted in the car, we'll get back to that. So I had to come up with a different way of making the seat than weaving it. So I made a pan and put all these little pieces of brass on it, and used thin leather from Model Factory Hero. It makes some really beautiful leather that's got adhesive on the back of it. Very pliable, very easy to use. And here it is in the car. So also the back of the dashboard, so you could see that, the back of the gauges is also detailed with the brass clamps that hold the gauges in place and all the wirings and fittings and everything. And there you can see the steering rack is also added. And that's also done with square tubing, so it all lacks together and works. Here's the fuel tank finished and added on the back of the car. And the front added with the headlights. And now the chassis is finished finally. The rest are just some pictures of putting the final touches together. So in order to take the body off, you have to pull the steering arm out, which you probably wouldn't want to do on a real car. Then the body lifts off, and the belly pan clips in, so you can take the body completely off the car. Here's with the door open. And finally finished after 11.5 years. Any questions? You have the microphone?
Speak loud.
No, they need to tape it.
How about the motor mount?
Are you going to have it on display in the main hall?
Yeah, I'll put it down there.
Good.
There's also, probably should talk about this a little bit. This is my build book. It's a Costco book. You put it together online. One trick, there's many places where you can do these books online and have them printed. They restrict what you can do, but most of them have a full-size page, for a picture. So you create that page on something else, save it as a JPEG, and then just upload it, and that's your page, your full-size page. So you can put any type, any graphics, anything you want in the book that you may not be able to if you just use what they make available to you online when you're building it. But this book will be down here too, and it's got descriptions and everything. I was talking to a few people this morning about workshops, and there's some pictures of workshop in here as well. You want to take a look at that. You said something about motor mounts?
Yeah, I was wondering if it had like a realistic motor mount. You know, your motor mounts on your flatheads mounted off the water pump.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Did you mount it there?
Yep.
And did you put a little rubber in there?
Yep. There's two motor mounts and then there's a transmission mount in the back.
There's even scale oil in it.
Actually, the fuel tank, the cap comes off. And I thought it'd be cool just to drop a gas in it. But I thought I might have trouble at the airport.
He wanted me to ask about the motor mounts again for the tape, you know.
Yeah, the motor mounts are just, they would be on any
Okay.
flathead. They're on the water pumps and the little rubber grommets underneath.
I used to drive flatheads, so that's kind of interested me on the
Yeah.
realism you had there. Thank you.
Anything else?
For traceability, yes.
For traceability, so that people can follow in your path, do you have a listing of the products and the companies for some of these things, or can you talk about some of those things? I took notes here, but like the punch, micromark, I'm on speed dial.
Shut up.
Yes, yeah, again, I've worked with small parts, I've worked with some of those I haven't heard of, because if you needed the leather, that would be...
I have a list in the back of the book that has everything listed, all the different companies that I got things from.
The tools as well?
No, I mean, the punch you can pick up at a local
Okay.
Tools Plus or, you know,
Okay.
Harbor Freight.
Harbor Freight.
Harbor Freight. You know, this is,
Yeah,
well,
some things.
it is a punch.
Okay.
A Whitney, okay.
Okay.
Jim Devine, a lot of you know him, he couldn't make it out this time. He came up to my house and we do work on cars sometimes together. He said, "Hey, look at this." I think he goofed up and put the wrong parts in the punch. But it was a mistake that said, "Wow, we could use this on models. This looks really cool."
So I guess one more on the machining aspect. When you're working on multiple parts, just some general guidelines so that, as you said, maybe you've got something set up with 4 of something or 2 of something. I'm assuming you've got multiple bases to mount on your lathe or your mill. So you would fix
Actually,
just how do you do it?
I have one chuck. I have one 3-draw chuck. That's why I start with everything round. But I can take that chuck from my lathe to my milling machine and back and forth. So as I'm making a part, depending on what I have to do and the steps I have to go through, I might start on the lathe, go over to the milling machine, work on it a little bit, back on the lathe. I can go back and forth without having to reset it. Also, I write down when I'm making a part, kind of shorthand, each move that I make, so that if I have to make another part, it is like a recipe right there that I just follow. But if I'm making multiples of the same part, I try to stack them and make them at the same time. Like the fin brake drums couldn't do that. So it's making sure everything is centered properly and starting in the same place and just paying attention to what you're doing.
Okay. And going from 1/48 down to 1/24, a little discussion on how you do that. That's brilliant because, again, minimizing mistakes.
Well, it's 1/12 is what I would,
1/12,
which,
yeah.
which is half. So I would draw it in 1/12 scale, take measurements from that with a set of calipers, and then just divide it in half, and that would give me my model dimension. And if I was off like a thousandth or something when I took the measurement, now I'm off half a thousandth because you're cutting it in half. And it's also a lot easier to draw in 12 scale than it is in 4 scale. Yes.
An easy
Wait
way to do
just a
that
second.
is to make your drawing in 12 scale or whatever scale you want to.
Hang on.
Start over.
An easy way to do that when you make your drawing a large scale is then just go down to your local FedEx store and they've got copying machines and you can reduce it any percentage you want. So
Right.
you make your drawing, let's say you're doing a 1/6 scale model, and so you do your drawings larger size, whatever it might be, scale.
Yeah.
And you can make your lines in your drawing really, really fine with a very, very sharp, pen or pencil or whatever, and then just take them down to FedEx and they can just reduce them down any size you want they have a little round device to calculate, the reduction. And that brings it automatically to scale. And you'll find you can do all kinds of fun details, and when you get them down there, then you can measure those parts in your 24th scale and dimension them from there. It makes it a lot easier. That way you don't have to be having numbers and stuff.
Yeah, I think you can also do that somewhat with a home printer. You can scale. Scale what's anything else? Everyone's falling asleep. It's a travel day. Yeah, he's got money.
Out of the 11 years that it took you to build it, did you keep track of the actual hours?
I didn't want to know. I would take off. I have 2 daughters who are, my youngest is just finishing up a master's degree, and they're both mechanical engineers. So I spent a lot of time with them. I was a stay-at-home dad for 20 years. So there was a lot of family time, a lot of other things that needed to be done, and modeling just wasn't as important. And also I got a little arthritis in my fingers, so I can only work for so long, and then I need to take a break. My eyes would need to take a break. My mind would need to take a break. But I enjoyed every minute of it. It's difficult for me now to sit down and try to put together a kit. Creating something yourself, it's a whole different level.
Did you use a shoreline lathe?
Jim,
Yeah,
away
just-
from the microphone.
On the scallops that you added to the tank, how did you cut that out?
I put the tubing on the milling machine, and I milled slots in it, and then I have a Dremel with an extension on it, so you have the hand piece with a cutoff. So I marked where I wanted to cut, and I just cut it by hand. So the round part was done with a milling bit, and then to get the point, I did that by hand. And then they just slide together. You paint one and plate the other, and just put them together. It was nerve-wracking putting the scallops on because they're put on like JB Weldon. You don't want to get that on where you don't want it.
So what brand did you use on your lathe and mill?
Shoreline.
Okay, that's what I thought.
That's what Augie had, so that's what I bought.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, nothing fancy. I don't have any digital readouts or anything like that. It's all figuring it out and doing it by hand. And if you mess up, you just say, well, it's just a scrap piece of metal. You throw it away and you start over again. It is. The materials to build this model were very inexpensive. The tools were not so. But now I have a lathe and a milling machine, a soldering machine, a plating system, so I'll use that on future models. It just adds so much joy to the hobby for me. But I just decided to try and see where I could go, and this is where I ended up.
you talk a little more about your experience and your equipment for the plating?
Of course. There are seminars online that were done last year that were excellent on cold wall plating. Basically, you're plating in a pail, in a bucket. Caswell Plating will send you this kit that has chemicals in it that are safe to use in your home. You mix it up with pure water. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me back over this way. How could you miss me? And there's a heating element that goes in the bottom of the pail. And you heat it up to about 90,
195.
195. So use a candy thermometer. Heat it up to about 195.
Give or take.
And then your parts have to be like a mirror. They have to be pristine. And they need to have some sort of steel contacted with them to get the plating started. So you can put them on steel wire or use a little piece of steel rod to touch against the part just to get it. It bubbles like an Alka-Seltzer. You put it in the plate, and you can plate it for 15 minutes, a half hour, depending on how thick you want the plating to be. And then there are chemicals, if you don't want to plate any longer, that you can add to it that will remove the things that shouldn't be there, and then you can just flush it down your toilet. So it's a very safe and easy plating system to use in your home. And they have plating solutions for plastic and all sorts of different things. I mean, this is just the one that I've used. And they've come out with 3 different formulas that each time look a little bit more like real chrome. But it's I think it was around $95 for the whole plating kit. Anything else? Cool. Time to go to the bar.
Thank you, Greg.